Welcome to the Herpcore History podcast, presented to you by Little Shop of Horrors. Feel free to reach out to us on any of our social media platforms for any of your feeder needs. All right, let's go ahead and get into this episode. All right, tonight I'm joined by Robert Hansen. He is the owner of Sierra Herps and has done a lot of work on different field guides. One of them being the California Reptiles and Amphibians field guide. So thank you very much for being here, Mr. Hansen.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks, Lewis, for the invitation.
Well, yes, sir. So what got you into reptiles in the beginning? How old were you?
You know, I've given a number of book talks this year, and I like to start out with early childhood memories because I think this is something that resonates with all of us. You know, what was your earliest herp memory? At what point did you realize that these things weren't just like other animals, right? You maybe not at the moment, but certainly as you look back on it, there might have been that special moment. Now, in my case, I was probably about 5 years old. My parents belonged to a card playing group and got together with a group of other adults a few times a year, and all of them had little kids. So the kids came along, we played. Eventually, we would crash and fall asleep on the floor of the house. But one particular place I remember being out in the backyard just as it was getting dark, and they had a pond feature in their yard. Now, remember, I'm like 5 years old, and I was just amazed to discover that this little water feature had toads in it. And I was just so fascinated by those. I would have been okay if my parents had just left me there that night. I would have been perfectly happy to just live with the toads in the backyard of this home. Now, there aren't very many things I remember from age 5. I remember getting in trouble in kindergarten for putting sand in a girl's hair, and I remember this experience with toads. So the fact that I can recall that, you know, many, many years later tells me that toads definitely resonated. And at the time, I didn't recognize it, but as an adult, that was sort of my aha moment. Now, growing up, I was very fortunate in that our family had a cabin in the Sierra Nevada, which, of course, is California's largest mountain range. And it was built, the cabin was built in 1922. My grandfather was a cattle rancher / physician, interesting professional combination. But he hauled some barn lumber up into the mountains in 1922 and built this cabin. So we were just a few hundred feet above the Tule River, which is a trout stream, nice trout stream. And I was allowed to roam the stream and the surrounding forest, even from a very young age, unsupervised. I trout fished every single day, sometimes twice a day. When I wasn't fishing, I was looking for snakes and lizards and scorpions. And it turned out to have just been a remarkable experience. So I spent my summers there, literally the Saturday after school let out in June till the end of Labor Day weekend. That was my home. And, you know, it's kind of remarkable looking on it now, how free I was to roam around without supervision. And certainly most of us, me included, as a parent, would not allow that. But it gave me a great opportunity to sort of grow up close and personal to things like California mountain king snakes, foothill yellow-leg frogs, Sierra garter snakes, and that sort of thing. So pretty special and a unique opportunity. I call it my feral childhood, where I was just lots of freedom to run around. So that was whatever the background. And I think, like a lot of kids back then who had an interest in small animals, you know, you're out catching stuff, putting them in jars and cages and buckets. And that's kind of just what we did. If you had an interest in reptiles, you basically had to catch your own. There was no captive breeding going on. You could certainly buy things at the pet stores. And I think I got my first baby boa constrictor when I was 15 years old. But for the most part, if you kept herps, you know, you went out and caught your own.
Yes, sir. And so you were going around, you were catching stuff. Sorry for the cat in the background. And you said you got your first snake when you were 15. Had you kept anything wild that you had
Yeah,
collected
oh sure.
up
Yeah,
until then?
uh, probably had a menagerie of really all sorts of animals. My parents were very tolerant, so I mean, we had all the usual suspects: guinea pigs, rabbits, um, budgies, canaries. We of course had the obligatory dog and cat, fish. But at some point, I really gravitated towards herps, and again, it was things that I would have kept. You know, the first gopher snake I found, which I thought was just amazing, even though, of course, we now know they're super common. Um, but yeah, probably the first serious snake where I actually had a cage built, and I got this baby boa, you know, imported from Colombia. Grew it up to be 9 feet long, which is really quite long considering it was a male. Um,
That's
it
a
got,
monster boa.
yeah, quite a bit of notoriety in the neighborhood. You know, in that era, I eventually gave it away as I'd acquired an adult female as well, and they were a little bit more than I had time to deal with. So yeah, that was my first serious snake, and I dutifully kept. You know, I measured it every month, kept track of shed records and feeding records and all that. It was a good experience, and of course my knowledge of how to keep a boa was basically developed from reading Carl Kauffeld's The Keeper and the Kept. You know, unlike today where you can sort of go online and instantly download a care sheet for, you know, a whole raft of species. Back then, information was quite limited. The other thing I should point out is that depending on where you live in this country, and California was no exception, if you had an interest in herps and you didn't live in a major city, you were kind of in a figurative desert. You know, you were kind of an island of with no interaction with other kids to share your interests. Certainly, no regional herp societies, no internet, obviously. So you know, whatever you managed to learn, you had to track it down on your own, go to the library, hang out at pet stores, hoping to interact with somebody who knew more than you did. So that was very, very different than what how things are now.
Yes, sir. Yeah, and you know, it's a topic that keeps coming up is how readily available information is now compared to when you guys first started getting into it, and it's an unfortunate double-edged sword because anybody can post a field guide or anybody can explain their opinion, and it's kind of depressing sometimes seeing new keepers coming in and asking questions and then getting bombarded with 20 ways to do it. And you know, how is that person supposed to learn?
No, and it's what I find, you know, and it's not just with herpetoculture, it's almost any manner of information. You know, certainly field biology, snake identification, it's pretty difficult for somebody who can't tell who the expert is who's responding versus somebody who's just tossing out random guesses. So yeah, that's a perennial source of frustration, but it's, you know, inevitable given the web.
Yeah, yeah. But hopefully, you know, that information's getting out and there's a better understanding. Well, besides your early field herping around the cabin and doing all that, did you at any point get into more like road herping and traveling for trips and doing that? And where
Yeah,
did that
so
come?
just to give you an idea of how naive I was, I was a teenager, and my mother was a high school teacher, and she had shared with one of her colleagues who was a biology teacher that, hey, my son has an interest in reptiles, or she probably says snakes. And he said, well, you know, he should try night driving. Well, I had never heard of night driving. You know, again, our information sources were so limited. So growing up in the 60s or 70s, there were just a handful of books. And, you know, the information was not all that detailed, but methods for finding things out in the wild were super limited. So this concept of night driving, what are you kidding me? You can go drive a car and find snakes on road. So I recruited a buddy of mine who had a car. I only drove motorcycles back then, rode motorcycles. So we went out, and that very first night out, we caught a longnose snake. Well, we found several things, but we found a long-nosed snake that, back then it was one of these black and white ones, lacked any red or orange in the interspaces. So we now know that phenotype is not unusual, but it was not depicted in field guides of the time. I think I had a 1966 first edition of Robert Stebbins' Field Guide of the Herps of the Western U.S. So he only depicted kind of the standard flavor of long-nosed snakes. And we found this black and white one, and I was just kind of mystified as to what it was, and finally narrowed down what the possibilities were. But yeah, so that was my literally my first night out finding this really cool herp snake. And then a few years later, I was an undergraduate in college, and I had now become best friends with Ron Tremper. So Ron, of course, is pretty well known in herpetoculture circles because he kind of became the leopard gecko king. But back then, he was just a couple of years ahead of me at Cal State University, Fresno. And we became fast friends once we learned of each other's pretty hardcore interest in herps. And we very quickly hatched a plan to go to Mexico. And we did so with enough time to apply for scientific collecting permits. So for the next 3 summers, this was in the mid-1970s, the next 3 summers we spent herping the west coast of Mexico. And we had scientific collecting permits. Ron was about to become the first curator of reptiles at the Fresno Zoo. So we actually, on one of those trips, we were collecting specimens that were going to go in the brand new reptile house at the zoo. And at the time, Ron's designs for environmental chambers were completely innovative. There was nothing like it in North American zoos, where individual chambers could be controlled for temperature, humidity, and light cycles. So we collected a number of specimens from Mexico, brought those back, and they made their debut in the reptile house. But yeah, so 3 summers, and those were amazing experiences. There were no field guides to the herps of Mexico. I researched all the literature on northwestern Mexico herpetology before we left, so I had a pretty good idea of what was where. But in the absence of the internet, the absence of field guides, the absence of color illustrations, your ability to identify things in the field was pretty limited. But it blew us away. If you were somebody who only had experience herping Southern California or Arizona, New Mexico, or West Texas, you get down into Sinaloa and Nayarit and Colima. The diversity of species. On one road on one night, you can get a Gila monster, a beaded lizard, a green rat snake, a boa constrictor, 2 kinds of coral snakes. The diversity was just mind-boggling, and the combination of species. So you might find, fairly common Sonoran desert things like gopher snakes and glossies, but co-occurring with things that were decidedly, Mexican in their distribution. So that was a pretty marvelous experience. I'm not sure we could replicate that anymore, given conditions in Mexico. But yeah, those were pretty formative. And, from then on, I was definitely hooked in herpetology, and I've kind of been involved in herp research ever since.
Yes, sir. Well, and that's so multifaceted cool, to your point about, you don't know if you could recreate that. But that is one of the things that I enjoy the most about getting out and going field herping is there's the unknown, right? What's going to be around that corner, and it might be a mountain lion, it might be a different snake. You never know, right? And that's the wonder in it. And then to get to be in a position where, to you, it's all new. You really don't know what you're about to see. What an amazing experience, and that is a specific time frame thing that you were able to experience.
Yeah, I mean, we actually found 2 snakes that, again, I had spent like 6 months in the university library accessing all the journal articles, sending away for papers. I filled 3 binders full of photocopies of scientific publications. And we mapped out distributions of things, where to hunt, and so forth. And yet, we encountered 2 snakes that we could not even identify to genus. right? Like we just had no idea.
Yes,
Uh,
sir.
and we brought them back, and we stopped in at the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum in Tucson, and contacted the herp curator there, who immediately identified them for us. And we've since learned a whole lot more about these things. But back then, again, in the absence of field guides or other good reference material, it was like, okay, what the heck are these things? But Western Mexico back in those days, we had no knowledge of narco activity. It's not that it wasn't going on. It's just, there was no Netflix show about it. And the LA Times was not talking about, the murders in Culiacan and that kind of thing. But when you're down there and you're noticing certain things, and then we ended up getting held up by narcos at night, which was pretty interesting. It was, guarding access to their growing area. And I actually wrote about this in a recent book. It's a book of essays on herp field adventures. And later on I'll send you some. I'll send you a cover shot of the book in case anybody's interested. It's basically full of pretty wild herp tales from around the world. But that was we didn't know enough to even be afraid. Right? It's like, oh, okay, I guess we probably shouldn't be here.
Yes, sir. And did any of you speak Spanish at the time?
I did, yes. And,
okay, wonderful.
So, once it became clear that we were, American students looking for snakes, we became gringos locos. And and they kind of, after checking us out, searching our vehicle, but it's a little unnerving when you come up to a roadblock with a bunch of automatic weapons pointed at you, and it ended well.
Yes, sir. Yeah, no, I could only imagine how. I mean, it's scary enough when you get pulled over by Border Patrol, and it's like, I know I'm not doing anything wrong here, but just that, and then to now be stopped by,
yeah,
I guess, what would be considered the bad guys, you'd be sat there going, oh no, I'd be peeing myself. I already get the shakes when I get pulled over by Border Patrol, so I couldn't imagine myself in that position. Well, that's very cool. And so what made you decide to start doing field guides? What got you into doing that?
So I have, maintained a fairly serious interest in herpetology all along. I became editor of the journal Herpetological Review in 1991, and was editor for 30 years, which was much longer than I had planned, but I concluded after 120 issues, so that was midway through 2021. And at that point, I was, had a lot more freedom with my time. So a colleague of mine, Jackson Shedd, who's based in Reno, Nevada, and I decided that California really needed an up-to-date, comprehensive herp field guide. And so we spent 3 years full-time working on that. It was published in January of this year. It's already in its second printing. It's gotten pretty terrific reviews. And after that experience, and we didn't kill each other, and we kind of found out that we have complementary skill sets. We're both organized, detail-oriented, and otherwise pretty easygoing. We worked well together. We pitched the idea of a Western U.S. and Canada field guide to our publisher, Princeton University Press, and they were happy to take that on. So that is something that we're hard at work at now, and the goal is to turn it into the publisher in 2027, and it typically takes about a year of production. So if things go according to plan, it should be born in 2028. But that's for anybody listening who's seen the California Field Guide, this will be a similar format to that, although we'll have to abbreviate a few things because California has 209 species and the Western Field Guide has 380 at this point anyway, about 380 species.
Wow. Yes, sir. Yeah, that's going to be substantially more information in there. And then, yeah, especially when you think about, when you're going out there and you don't see the animal represented that's there early on. I guess now looking back, it's like, okay, well, it makes sense. We can only put so much information in here. We're only given so many pages to work with.
Well, what we did with the California book, frankly, we put together a field guide that we would have wanted to have in our grubby little hands as 20-year-olds. We wanted something hardcore that would be accessible to a broad readership. So by that, I mean young people, amateur naturalists and so forth, but also have enough meat in it that professional herpetologists would find it an indispensable resource. And so that's what we did. We basically did what we wanted to do, and we found a publisher who was willing to let us get away with it. And when I say get away with it, again, you kind of need to see the book, and maybe I'll share with you some sample color plates so you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. But one of the things that we have felt was lacking in a lot of field guides is a full representation of phenotypic diversity. In other words, let's think about, since many of people listening to this are familiar with California king snakes, either in the field or as part of captive breeding collections. And you know that Cal Kings come in a variety of flavors. Some of those are created by selective breeding, but many of those are naturally occurring morphs, if you will. And we wanted to depict as many of those as possible. So I think we have something like 3 pages of different flavors of naturally occurring California king snakes. Excellent. So I don't think you'll see that anywhere else other than Brian Hubb's Common King Snake book. But we do the same thing for rosy boas, California mountain king snakes, salamanders, frogs, anything that has a lot of color and pattern variation. We didn't want to just have one, here's your postage stamp representative of species X. And when in fact species X occurs in multiple color and pattern combinations. So we did that. We photographed everything on white background. So the animal is set against a neutral background, which makes it much, much easier to pick up on subtle differences in markings. And obviously, though, that required a lot of new work for us, running around, acquiring specimens for photography, and enlisting the help of lots and lots of people to collect things on our behalf.
Yes, sir. And what a great resource for multiple reasons. One, to do with the passion of this is the book we wanted to see as kids, or as younger people. That's amazing already. But then, too, so often I think we'll see someone around us that doesn't know anything about reptiles, and we think, that person doesn't know anything. But it's just they don't know what we know, and so the average person that will hopefully take the time to get your book and look at it will have such a better resource of going, it doesn't look like this, but it still's the same thing. Where a lot of people, how often can people not identify a rattlesnake? Where we think it's so it would be very simple to do that. The average Joe might not be able to do that. So to have such a great resource that you guys took the time to document those different localities and to highlight that, I think is invaluable to people, really.
Well, the other thing that we did is involve a lot of people in the process. So I think in our acknowledgments, there's something like 270 names listed, which is kind of crazy. It ranges from, museum curators, university professors, and people that my friends I lovingly refer to as the snake chaser crowd, who were happy to have specific targets, places to go and work that they've hadn't been to before, knowing that the results of their efforts were going to be sort of immortalized in a field guide. And that's kind of what's happened. In fact, there's one snake image in there where the snake was found by the young son of a friend of mine. And he is very proud of the fact that he spotted the snake and not his dad, who's a very well-known field herper. But, for a lot of the images in the book, people can say, that's my animal, right? That's something that I caught or whatever. And so we had the help of zoos, zoos that provide that maintain captive collections of assurance colonies typically for state or federally endangered species. And government researchers, all kinds of people helping us out. And the other thing we did is involve experts, both regional experts and species experts, in reviewing species accounts and distribution maps. So our maps were reviewed by 50 different people. So the end result, and I think for anybody who's kind of a connoisseur of field guides, can recognize differences, right? You know when a field guide is well done, and you know when one kind of falls short of the mark. And very often, the size of your acknowledgement section is an indirect measure of that. It reflects, how much homework the authors did to ensure that the information they're presenting is the best available. And it doesn't just mean what's in print. There's a lot of great information that field herpers have, and I think to a large extent that's reflected in our species accounts for the California book.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Very interesting. Very good. Well, besides going to Mexico, what was your early field herping like? I assume you were doing it mainly in California at that point. Had you gone out of California?
I think early on it was California. Now, I'm sort of beating the California bandwagon here, but California is incredibly diverse. It spans like 9.5 degrees of latitude. So, it's a tall state. We've got like 20 different, significantly different, what I call biotic communities. They range from the cool, wet, fern-filled, moss rock covered coastal forests to 3 deserts: Great Basin, Mojave, and the Colorado subdivision of the Sonoran Desert. So, we've got the highest and lowest elevation points in the continental U.S. from Mount Whitney to Badwater Basin, and they're separated by only 50 miles. So with all of that diversity, there's just no shortage of places to explore. And we got a ton of public lands. I know you're in Texas. I just returned from Texas, and one of the great frustrations of herping, east of New Mexico in the Southwest, is you run out of public land. So much of West Texas, virtually all of it, is in private ownership. So you're really limited on where you can go. And by contrast, you get farther west, and we've got tons of open public spaces, lands that are managed by BLM or the Forest Service or the Park Service that belong to all Americans. And it's a great resource. And gosh, man, for anybody who's got an interest in herps, it's kind of unlimited possibilities. So that's a long answer to your question. But yeah, I primarily spent my time, and I was studying particular groups of animals too for scientific research. So I was really focused on a group of salamanders, and I was also involved in a study of garter snakes. So it helped me focus my field attention on areas where those animals occurred.
Yes, sir. Yeah. No, and even in Texas, I have, for multiple reasons, kind of kept my focus within West Texas over time, and part of that is that I'm addicted, for a lack of better words, to herping and field herping in West Texas. And so, the idea of getting to go to Mexico is something that, I've dreamed about. But let's say if and when I ever do get to do that, is the draw going to be the same that it is to go out here and go herping, where it's like I can't, just that pull to go there is so strong. If it was more difficult to get there, I don't know what I would do with myself.
Yeah, so I think certainly we, and me in particular, were spoiled in terms of having access to, abundant public lands, whether mountains or deserts or everything in between.
Yes, sir,
yeah.
But,
yes. So Mexico, I did the 3 summers with Ron Tremper in Mexico, and then starting in the early 2000s, I got involved with a project to study king snakes of the Lamprepeltis mexicana group. So
yes,
my primary interest was initiated by a guy named Robert Bryson, who was just finishing up a master's at Sul Ross State University in Alpine in West Texas. And I got wind of Rob's thesis, and it was an initial kind of mitochondrial DNA study of the Lamprepeltis mexicana complex of king snakes. And I was really interested in that. I didn't know anything about them. I did not have any experience with captive animals from that group. But what I did know is that there was a lot of pattern variation, what we would call polymorphism. And I was fascinated by that. So I contacted Rob and said, hey, what's next? What are you planning on doing? And we got talking, and we ended up agreeing to collaborate and collect additional samples from Mexico with a goal of sort of unraveling the mysteries. For anybody who's a Mexicana king snake aficionado, you will understand that, we've got this group of 5 or 6 species. Some are pretty well defined. One in particular, what hobbyists used to call theori, we now know as Lamprepeltis leonis, has a tremendous range of pattern types, from all black, these jet black melanistic ones, to what we call milk snake phase or the coral snake mimic phase, to ones that have narrow crossbands, and then lots of in-betweeners. And we still don't know about the distribution of each of those forms. So, there's a lot of question marks. And so we did publish one paper on gene flow, but we restricted that to Alterna. I think that was published in 2019. And then Jerry Salmon and I collaborated on a monograph of the group that was published in, I think, 2017. It runs about 60 pages. I can provide a link. I'll share with you later, but it's also on the sierraherps.com website. If you go to the sierraherps.com and then click on the bibliography page, the opening paragraph, there's a link to our paper, and it's kind of everything you ever wanted to know, at least from a scientific perspective, about that group of snakes. It's a great starting point, whether you are a seasoned hobbyist or field herper or just getting interested in that group of snakes. They're really fascinating. But what that did is it jump-started my involvement with herpetoculture, because for Mexico, getting collecting permits, we were permitted to collect tissue samples, but we were not permitted to bring live snakes out of Mexico. So all the snakes had to stay in Mexican collections. But tissue samples for DNA work, that was fine. So but I was just really interested in this group, and I thought, well, I need to get some live animals. And again, not knowing, this is several years before we really got into it. We were spending field time down there. So I started out with a pair of theori, which we called them at the time. And that sort of ballooned because I was really anxious to sort of have every flavor. I just thought this was the coolest thing. That, one species of snake has this much pattern diversity is just remarkable. So I was interested in patterns of inheritance, trying to make some sense of where each of these forms lived. And then, of course, later on, getting to do field work in Mexico and, gaining an appreciation for how hard these things were to field collect and all of that. So that interest has not abated. We're still working on the group with some Mexican collaborators, and maybe we'll see something in print and, maybe some new discoveries here in the next couple of years.
Well, excellent. I'm very excited about it. I remember when I was first made aware of that paper that you're speaking about, and to say that me and my buddy nerded out on that. I mean, we were like little schoolgirls, sending it to each other, and then every 15 minutes be like, did you see this part? Did you see this? Look how cool this is. And so, that, because there's so little information on Alterna in general and the whole Mexicana. So to see someone put that in a paper, that was, we were so excited about that.
Well, it was preceded by this website that I thought it would just be fun to, if nothing else, kind of do Nuevo Leon king snakes, aka theori, have a little website with some information. Well, then it sort of mushroomed into this thing where, well, we're going to pull in all the other species in this complex. I'm going to provide range maps. a whole summary of taxonomic history for this group, links to virtually everything that's ever been published. I think there's over, probably 500 or 600 citations. There's a lot of literature there.
Yes, sir.
It's overkill, but if anybody wants it, so it's a great resource and a great entree into that group of snakes. But that was about a 6-month sort of obsession, aided by my buddy Brad Alexander, who had some web skills. So that was the first iteration of the website, and it's been modified since. But so yeah, that went from that to the monograph, and having a whole bunch of live king snakes around here.
And that's what's so cool about them. And again, I think it's something that it is. I feel like lost, especially with newer keepers coming into the hobby. Is again focused on Alterna here, but that people go, oh, this is what a Christmas animal looks like, or a river road, and it's not that you can't find an animal that looks like that in that area, but that is usually one or many keepers' selection over time to bring out the best traits. But you can pull a real dog from the Christmas Mountains, and same with River Road, where looking at a picture of that animal, it wouldn't be representative of what the average person that's not necessarily a field herper in that area would understand that locality to look like.
Yeah, for sure. I will say though that for Christmas animals in general are difficult to find, and the odds of finding the one that we refer to sort of as the Holy Grail, the dark black with orange crossbands, they're out there, and I have had. They're no longer with me, but I had an adult pair wild caught, and I've got F1s currently that are out of this world, but those are naturally occurring. It's just they're super rare in nature.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
But yeah, otherwise, there's a lot of things that have been refined by captive breeding.
Yeah, for sure. And it's just interesting because, I think that almost when we're talking about localities and this and that, I think very quickly in your selective breeding that maybe you should pop your name in front of it and call it, this is your line of this thing, because what are the chances those animals they wouldn't have ran into each other, the offspring wouldn't, you wouldn't have selected what you found to be the best in that area.
Yeah, very true. And obviously anybody who's been around Alterna for a time and has either observed or participated in online conversations about what constitutes locality kind of will be chuckling at this discussion right now, because for the most part, there's not many people who are well versed in population biology and don't have a sense of what it means to recognize things as a locality. I mean, you can call them anything you want, right? You can do whatever you like. But from a biological perspective, if you just have a couple of migrants per generation, you're going to have gene flow.
Yes, sir.
So, but, with the Christmas, I know there are people who are hung up on, the cut south of the mailbox at Wild Horse to the 4 Mile North cut, and and never the twain shall meet, when, of course, there's habitat, all in between. Yeah. And the same, and the river road is the same way, right? I mean, because you're basically not walking cuts. You have the big hill, and then for the most part, it's road hunting, and it's largely all Alterna habitat. I mean, certainly snakes tend to show up at some places more frequently than others, but that's a pretty broad zone. Same with Black Gap.
Yeah, yeah, it is pretty funny. Early on when I first started getting into it, I was told, and what I thought was, when you see a cut or what would be a hill, that is the only place and it's like, as I've learned more, and that's not how that works. There's so much gene flow, and they move a lot more than what we thought they did, and there's also just there's so much limestone for them to be traveling through and moving from point A to point B. Who knows where that animal's starting out at, where it's ending its night.
Yep.
And then heading back. Yeah, super interesting. Well, when was your first trip out to West Texas?
So my first trip to West Texas was not until 2009, and frankly, I had avoided, um, you know, invitations from friends to go out there because I'd heard stories about, all these cars and people crowding on cuts, and that was just not my idea of a good time. I was used to pretty much when I was in the field, I was either the only human around, or I might have had one or two friends. But the idea of even running into other herpers was a foreign concept for us. So, maybe in Southern California, if you grew up road cruising out in the desert at Whitewater Canyon, that was certainly a popular spot. But in my experience, I never ran into anybody. And I love that because for me, it was more than just finding animals. It was the whole experience of being out in the wild, right? You're taking in the whole landscape, the whole experience. That was important to me. And this idea of, well, you can only road hunt because there's no public land. And if you're looking for gray bands, the only place to find them is on such and such a cut. You got to walk these cuts. You got semi trucks, cruising past you at 70 miles an hour. You got border patrol. You got Brewster County Sheriff's deputies harassing you, and so on. And that just didn't seem all that appealing. So
Yes, yeah.
I'd avoided it for as long as I could, and then finally, my buddy Brad Alexander said, "You got to come out." So we went out, and well, I have to tell you, we found 3 Christmas Mountains Alterna, and
Well, okay.
and it was like, holy crap, how hard can this be? Um, and what was funny, of course, is the word traveled really fast, as it does. And even though we were not trumpeting these finds, there were people around us who became aware, and soon there were herpers from other places who had descended, to South Brewster County. They'd heard about, the Hansen and Alexander 3 Alterna find, and so yeah, but that was obviously beginner's luck, uh, and it was a perfect set of conditions. It had rained pretty hard, I think 3 or 4 days prior to our arrival, and then things just happened. It was pretty cool.
Yes, yeah.
So then the very next year we go out again, and I should say that we had a great time. Both Brad Alexander and I are serious photographers, so we brought all of our camera gear. We set up photo studios in the place we were staying, complete with fake nature backgrounds. We had people stopping by to bring animals that for us to photograph, but also, hey, would you mind if I photograph this animal on your background? Oh, sure. So it was a very social thing, and I realize that's part of the appeal, right? Is this gathering of herpers and comparing stories and sharing results and all that. So we had a great time. So we go back the next year. This time we're out on the river road, and things had been really dry. And to my knowledge, and to what I was told, there had not been any Alterna found that year yet on the river road. So on this particular night, but I think it had rained. So on this particular night, as I recall, there were 7 vehicles cruising on River Road. Well, there were 2 Alterna found that night on River Road, the first 2 of the season. They were found by people in a single vehicle. And you can guess whose that was. So we found both of them. And I mean, it is absolutely dumb luck because it's all road cruising, right? And especially on river road, things tend to be moving. It's typically quite warm. So both these animals were scooting across the road, and we just, happened to be there at that moment in time. And so, again, I'm thinking, how hard can this be? Go take 2 trips, find 5 Alterna. We went, I think, not the next year, but maybe the year after that, and struck out. So I think, the law of averages was finally coming around to haunt us, and but that was fine because I I was interested in everything. I was happy to find night snakes and ground snakes and subocs and rock rattlesnakes. It was all great. We would go out in the daytime and shoot landscapes in the park because stuff would be in bloom there. So we had a blast.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Oh, that, so just, as I'm sure you've heard many a time from many herpers, me personally, it took me 10 years to find my first live alterna of going out 2 times a year for a week at a time. And I would find the first one I ever found was a road-killed animal just squished completely into the pavement. And then the second one I found went into a hole and I never found it. And then the first year I found one, I found two. And then ever since then, now me and my partner were up to 7. But it took 10 years to find my first one.
Yeah, I mean that's not an uncommon story, and the notion. I mean, anybody who's listening to this, of course, is well aware of the idea that there are people down there making money by collecting alterna and selling them is just ludicrous because you can spend an awful lot of time, which means, of course, gas, and if you're having to pay for lodging, there's no way that you are going to even recoup what your outlay was for these herping forays.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that was one of the stigmas that got put on field herpers early on that's what was going on, and especially nowadays the interest is not in field collecting. Even for myself, the amount of animals that I even touch is so minimum now at this point. If I see it, it's just like, wow, look at that, there it is. Grab my phone real quick, take a picture for the timestamp for the logbook, and I never touch that animal. It's like bird watching, but better.
Yeah, no, you're right. Well, there's a whole different group of people that are spending time out in the field, and whether we call them Instagram herpers or what, but some of them are notorious. Not my favorites. I think they're exploiting the animals, but a lot more people just out photo documenting for the experience, and that's great.
Yes, sir. Yeah, it's definitely an improvement in the hobby, and from early on, you hear kind of your description of West Texas and what it was like. That came well before me. The most that I'd ever experienced was during the whole coronavirus thing, and that was insane. The amount of people that were out there, and I remember my partner being like, "Dude, this is almost like what it used to be like when he first started going out."
Wow.
That was but that was very depressing to see those many people out there. But we've been doing it for a while, so we knew where to go where people weren't going to be, and
sure,
and had a great time. Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, so early on, so you got your first wild caught animal from down in the United States. It was a boa, and then did you keep reptiles throughout that? You said that for the most part you didn't up until recently. I think is what I remember.
I had a real potpourri of things. So typically, because I spent a lot of time in the field, and I would find stuff that I just was interested in. It might be a night snake or a lyre snake. A rubber boa, so I might have one of each of those kinds of things, and I learned by observing them in captivity, which is kind of what you did back then.
Yes,
I know that some of that is frowned on now because obviously, if every kid or young person did that, might not be healthy for the herps, but that's what you did. It's not like bird watching where you can go out with binoculars and study a bird. If you wanted to find out something about a snake, it was helpful if you could put it in a terrarium and observe it that way. So yeah, I had a real odd assortment of things, which was great from my perspective. Not a whole lot of captive breeding was going on, and I was just keeping stuff out of my own interests. I wasn't breeding or selling at all.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, and I especially someone like yourself to get to look at those animals and see how they move around and what they're doing, that's invaluable. It's what a good idea.
Well, I'm always impressed, especially nowadays, if I run into somebody who is a really serious keeper of obscure species, right? Like shovel nose snakes or
Yes, sir.
any number of small colubrids that aren't necessarily appealing to your typical hobbyists who are into king snakes and boas and all the usual suspects. But somebody who is specializing in things that feed on invertebrates and has figured out how to make them thrive, even reproduce. I think that is much more impressive than, tossing white mice at king snakes, which is mostly what I do. They've had to learn from scratch, right? They've had to figure things out, and for most of us at this point, in 2025, the formula for breeding most things is pretty obvious. It's pretty well known.
Yes, sir. Yeah, no, for sure. Some of that obscure stuff for a while. I was trying to establish a group of variable ground snakes, because what a cool underappreciated animal.
I'm glad you mentioned those. Recently there's been a taxonomic split in that group. So
Okay.
the plains ground snake is now considered a separate species from the variable ground snake. So what's interesting though is the ranges of these things overlap in West Texas, and for the unicolored flavor, and both species, Sonora episcopa, which is the plains ground snake, and then Sonora semiannulata, which is the more widespread variable ground snake. Both of those come in, as you know, unicolored morphs, banded morphs, brown ones, orange ones, striped ones. Well, they overlap in West Texas, and the unicolored ones you can't tell apart. Genetically, they're quite distinct. But if you saw them in the field, so for example, out on the river road, they've found genetically confirmed specimens of both species, and
Wow.
that's kind of maddening, especially for me who's preparing a field guide. There's going to be some areas in eastern New Mexico and southwest Texas where, if you find a banded one, there's a way to distinguish them. But if you get a unicolored one, it's just going to be, sorry guys, this is as good as it's going to get. Call it a ground snake. But
Wow.
they are a wonderful example of variability. It's just spectacular. We have that species in California, so we don't have all of the flavors, but we have a pretty good diversity, and we were able to include just about all those in the California guide. And we've since added a number of images for the Western Field Guide that's in preparation. And Arizona's got one that I call a tantilomorph, right? It's like a black-headed snake. It literally is a unicolored snake with a black head cap. And especially for the little guys, when you first look at it, you're thinking, well, that's just a juvenile tantilla. Well, no, that's, if you look closely at the head, you'll see it's a ground snake.
Wow. That's so interesting. And that's wow, what a great tidbit of information there. I appreciate that. I'll look more into that. That got me super excited. That's very cool.
Well, yeah, I mean, it sort of goes to, like, if you think about it, so I think most of the people listening to us have this conversation, I would say the majority are probably snake enthusiasts, right? So how come some snake species are super variable and others are not? What drives that? So that's a sort of an open-ended question that I'm not even going to tackle right now, but just thinking about snakes that you might have an interest in. Is your species something that occurs in a number of different pattern types? Do those pattern variations, are they present in a single locality or population, or is it geographic based? In other words, in this part of the range, they look like this, and someplace far away, they look a little bit different. But especially for ones where that variation is in the same area, what is that all about? What is driving that polymorphism? What is driving that variation? And so, yeah, Fun, fun thing to talk about over adult beverages.
Yes, yeah. No, I mean that's yeah, I'll resist from talking more about that
Or
because
those are the things you talk about when you're night driving and nothing is out.
yes,
Right?
yes, exactly.
You've exhausted all your topics of conversation, and so now you're down to this.
Well, no, and that's the thing. I mean, to for the hours not only that we spent when we were originally reading your paper you put out on the diversity of Lamprey that then the hours and hours of conversation that it's afforded us as we were out field herping, where we're just bouncing these ideas back and forth that yeah, to have you bring that up, I'm having to fight myself so hard not to go, well, but what do you think about this? And what about, so
I have
I'll try to not do
thoughts,
that.
but often it's just wild speculation and not supported by any good evidence. But I will say another project that I can touch on in a minute, but we've run a snake transect, basically a road-based study for over 40 years, which is kind of staggering how long we've been doing it. But there were nights where we would have what we call a data-rich night. In other words, there was a lot of stuff moving, and then other nights where it's dead, and you're not able to figure out why. So I mean, that's a perennial thing that all of us talk about, right? Is how come snakes move on some nights and not on other nights? Now, alterna hunters, you guys are glued to your weather apps, and you're looking at barometric pressure and wind direction and all these kinds of things, when it last rained and so on. But what about other things? And what about desert systems where the weather, like changes in atmospheric pressure, really aren't at play, and yet conditions might be the same from one night to the next, and yet activity levels are profoundly different? So what's that all about? Kind of like, why did the chicken cross the road? Or and so those things, when you're not finding stuff, we just have great conversations, right? We speculate what's driving this.
Yes, sir.
But I have to say that when we started this study, which was like in 1982, so we have no satellite radio in the vehicle. Your AM radio station, this is out in the Mojave Desert, so you might be picking up something from, at night AM, you might be Salt Lake City or Las Vegas. And inevitably, you'd get one of these AM stations that had a strong signal, and you'd get this guy named Art Bell. So Art Bell, that name will resonate with some of you, but I think he's dead now, but he ran this nightly radio call-in show that was devoted to things like UFOs and paranormal activity. And people would call in, right? So, and share their like alien abduction stories. So that was our filler material, right? We didn't have XM satellite radio that we could, get Comedy Central or good music or whatever. It was good old Art Bell and UFOs.
Yes, sir. Yeah, we're so spoiled today. Even when just having the temperature on the display of your car.
Oh yeah.
I that's always brought up to me, like, hey man, we didn't have that when we were going out there. It wasn't like that when I started.
Yeah, in the olden
yes,
days.
sir. I know. Yes.
Well, so just because you mentioned that, think about the initial discovery that you could find snakes in the desert at night. I mean, now Lawrence Klauber, the famous rattlesnake researcher out of San Diego, is credited with sort of popularizing or making known the whole concept of road cruising at night for snakes. But I think the earliest use of illumination was lantern walking, and spotted leaf-nosed snakes, Phylorhynchus decurtatus, were super rare in collections back in, I think this was like early 1920s. And then by lantern walking at night in the desert, suddenly collectors were able to locate these snakes. So the techniques for finding things were decidedly more primitive back then, and now we've got special headlamps, and not to mention all manner of high-powered lights. Just any online discussion, throw out a question about hey, what lights do you recommend for hunting alterna? And you'll get a number of great, very well informed opinions. But there's so many good lights out there now, and it's just unbelievable.
Yes, sir. It's so funny, right? Getting into alterna hunting. Yes, to your point earlier about weather apps. Yeah, it's about the snakes, and then my other hobbies are weather apps and flashlights.
Exactly.
So yeah, sir, that's very accurate to what the hobby boils down to at a certain point. But yeah, that's so interesting, because when you proposed that question and brought that idea up, I was like, oh yeah, the idea of going herp at night, and then you took it back even further than what I was thinking, and it's like, oh yeah, like someone had to be before the guy driving down the road looking for his snake. Wow, yeah. Well, what an interesting perspective.
Yeah, so there are several road-based studies of snakes that have been published over the years, and one early one that I is a good starting point was published in either 66 or 68, but it was based on Highway 80 in southeastern Arizona, and it's a place that is well known to herpers who go to Arizona in the summertime. So Highway 80 on up to the Portal Road, and that has been initially surveyed in the 1960s for several summers, and the results were published, and it was just cool, right, to see what species were there and what kind of numbers and what were the habitat associations. Well, then that study was replicated about 30 years later by Joe Mendelson and Brian Jennings, and they found more species. In fact, they recorded some species that were completely missed in the initial one, and it's a fascinating thing to think about. Was this a result of crummy headlights? When you're road cruising in the 1960s, what was the quality of headlamps or headlights for your vehicle? And would you be more likely to miss little things like black-headed snakes and night snakes? Or could it be that the guy doing the surveys had bad vision? I don't know which of those is true, but it's interesting that they picked up a different, slightly expanded list of species and more stuff. But yeah, we stumbled upon a road in the northwestern Mojave Desert long ago that ranged from the valley floor up the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada. So the elevational range was from about 2,500 feet on the desert floor to 6,200 feet at the head of this desert canyon. And it occurred to me that of all the road-based studies of snakes that have been published over the years, not a single one has followed an elevational gradient or an elevational transect. There's simply been a road. We found a good road, didn't have a lot of traffic on it. We're going to road cruise and keep track of everything we find, and we're going to do this for a bunch of years and see what it looks like. So there's been those kinds of studies done fairly often, everything from the Everglades to southwestern U.S. deserts, but nothing ever with an elevational change like on our road. So we started that in 82. We're still going. We're getting close to a sample size of 3,000 snakes, which is a lot. And we've really uncovered some cool things and had a blast doing it. It's not a sophisticated project. Anybody could do that kind of thing. I refer to it as recreational science. Of course, gas wasn't nearly as expensive when we started as it is now. But we've had a lot of people helping out over the years, and it's really amazing the patterns that have been revealed that are otherwise unknown. I mean, there's nothing published about certain activity patterns or the biology of a lot of these species that aren't revealed until you look at all your results on a spreadsheet, and then you see these patterns take shape.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Well, and that's interesting too. A lot of those earlier papers that you were speaking about, I'm pretty sure I'm familiar with, and one of the things that any time, especially for many years there, anytime there was any sort of paper that talked about specific roads or areas, I would go to that paper and then I would dig down and start trying to figure out, well, what was the pattern? What made this animal decide to move? And you know, there's certain things you'll see where you go, okay, but then here's an outlier. So is it that? Is it this? And just that ongoing questioning of it. And so to kind of hear as time's gone on and someone like yourself that has those ideas and applying it to this, you know, I'm very excited about that. So look forward to seeing that as well. Is there anything else? I think that, I mean, I could keep sitting here and talking to you all night. Is there anything that I've missed that I should have brought up?
Oh man, I don't think so. We've covered a lot of ground. Had a great conversation. Appreciate the invitation to be on your podcast. And I'll share some photos later and some links that I think people might have an interest in.
Excellent. Well, I'll make sure to put those down at the bottom. So anyone, any information that I'm given, I'll post it down there for you guys. And again, thank you so much in your busy schedule to take the time to sit down with me. And again, just thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure, Lewis. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Let me zoom out on you here. Okay, you got a message for the time capsule?
Yeah, and it's simply this. My prediction for you is that even though you'll forget all about this in some way consciously, next summer at about this time, you'll remember to return.